Americans who are paying more for daily essentials want to see the president act, not ramble from a podium. Affordability isn't some kind of messaging issue, and it's certainly not a scam, as Donald Trump claims. From inside his little bubble, he doesn't even realize what Americans are going through as they worry and struggle to pay the bills that come in each week and each month. It's a crisis Donald Trump himself exacerbated with his own policies. There aren't enough speeches in the world to reverse the damage Donald Trump has done to rising costs. After all, those tariffs have raised prices across the board on groceries, on clothing, on energy. And whose tariffs are they? Donald Trump's. Who promised to bring costs down on day one and then turned around and cut health care, cut SNAP benefits, closed rural hospitals, and axed good-paying any...
Listen to what you just witnessed, because this is the moment the veil is ripped clean off the grotesque con job that has been perpetrated against the American people, and wait until you understand the full scope of what Schumer just articulated from that floor. Because what we're watching here, nothing less than the complete psychological dissociation of a ruling class from the lived reality of working families. And you need to understand that when Trump stands at his podium and calls the affordability crisis a scam, a messaging issue, a hoax perpetrated by Democrats, what he is engaging in is textbook gaslighting of the most pernicious variety, because grocery prices have gained 1.4% between January and September, and U.S. consumer prices have risen 1.7% on average during Trump's second term, and yet he has the audacity to tell Americans their pain isn't real, while the tariffs amount to an average tax increase of $1,000 for U.S. household in 2025, and this is precisely the kind of elite detachment from material conditions that breeds genuine revolutionary sentiment throughout history, because we're not talking about abstract policy debates in ivory towers. We're talking about families making impossible choices between medication and groceries, between rent and heat, between survival and catastrophe. Now here comes the bombshell that should make your blood absolutely boil, because Trump this week tried to downplay concerns about cost of living, saying affordability doesn't mean anything to anybody during a cabinet meeting. And I want you to really sit with that statement for a moment, because what Trump is revealing here is the fundamental contempt that billionaire oligarchs harbor toward the economic precarity experienced by ordinary Americans. Trump said at the White House when asked about the elections and consumers' concerns about paying for groceries, "I don't want to hear about the affordability," which represents perhaps the most honest articulation of his governing philosophy that we have seen, because he genuinely believes that the suffering of working families is an inconvenient narrative obstacle to his political messaging, rather than an urgent crisis demanding immediate redress, and what Schumer is doing here is performing the essential democratic function of naming that cruelty with precision and moral clarity. But wait, because it gets exponentially worse when you examine the actual policy mechanisms through which Trump has engineered this crisis. And here's where the economic theory meets brutal reality, because under the tariffs imposed and scheduled as of November 1, the weighted average applied tariff rate on all imports rises to 15.8%, and the average effective tariff rate reflecting behavioral responses rises to 11.2%, the highest average rate since 1943, which means Trump has essentially imposed the largest U.S. tax increase as a percent of GDP 0.47% for 2025 since 1993. And this is a regressive tax that falls disproportionately on working class and poor families who spend a higher percentage of their income on consumer goods, and some of that reflects Trump's tariffs on imported goods like toys and clothing and appliances, and tariff measures starting in the spring. The import taxes have increased the inflation rate by 0.7 percentage points between March and August, which translates into real material deprivation for millions of families already living paycheck to paycheck. And here's the truly diabolical aspect of this manufactured crisis that reveals the fundamental class warfare being waged by this administration. Because while Trump's tariffs are extracting an income loss of $1,700 for the average U.S. household, according to research from Yale's Budget Lab, simultaneously, his administration is slashing the social safety net programs that provide the only buffer between working families and destitution, because about 10.9 million people could lose their coverage over the next 10 years, according to the Congressional Budget Office, from Medicaid cuts alone, and the SNAP cuts total an estimated $230 billion over 10 years, which means Trump is executing a pincer movement against working-class American, raising their costs through tariffs, while simultaneously gutting the programs that help them survive those increased costs. And this is wealth redistribution in reverse. This is taking from the poor to give to the rich, and calling it economic policy. The sheer audacity of what Schumer is describing here, should ignite righteous fury in anyone with even a rudimentary understanding of economic justice, because almost half of Americans say it's harder to afford groceries today than it was a year ago, according to a September survey by Axios and the Harris Poll. A survey this summer by the Associated Press and NORC found the cost of groceries has become a major source of stress for just over half of all Americans, outpacing rent, healthcare, and student debt, which means this is not some fringe concern or manufactured grievance. This is the defining economic reality for the majority of American families, and Trump's response is to dismiss it as fake news, to retreat into his gilded bubble, and to gaslight the entire nation about what they can plainly see in their bank accounts and feel in their bones. Now let me take you deeper into the policy violence being enacted here, because what Trump has done is not merely failed to address rising costs, he has actively exacerbated them through a series of deliberate choices that prioritize corporate profits and tax cuts for the wealthy over the basic well-being of working families. Low and middle-income households that previously qualified for the tax credits would likely see their ACA premiums rise from an average of $888 in 2025 to $1,904 in 2026, because the subsidies that made healthcare affordable were allowed to expire during a government shutdown that Democrats tried desperately to prevent, and the Trump administration's unprecedented tariffs, the immigration crackdown, and global natural disasters have rattled the food supply chain, and grocery prices rose in August at their fastest pace in 3 years and increased again in September, which creates this cascading effect where every aspect of household budgets is being squeezed simultaneously. But here's where it becomes almost unbearably cruel, and you need to understand the full scope of this assault on working families, because Republicans are offsetting some of those costs with cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, along with major changes to Medicaid, the joint federal and state program that provides health care for roughly 70 million low-income elderly and disabled Americans, and the bill imposes new 80 hours per month work requirements on able-bodied Medicaid recipients aged 19 to 64, who don't have dependents, including working or other approved activities such as volunteering, and under the bill's current text, these work requirements won't kick in until 2026. Which sounds reasonable, until you understand that these requirements are specifically designed to kick people off assistance through administrative burden, rather than actually connecting them to meaningful employment, because the evidence is overwhelming that work requirements don't increase employment, they just increase poverty and uninsurance. And wait until you grasp the full implications of what Trump has done to rural America, because this is where his policies reveal themselves as a form of geographical warfare against the very communities that voted for him in overwhelming numbers. And the cruel and far-reaching cuts to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act are putting hundreds of rural hospitals at risk of closure, limiting services or mass layoffs, and rural hospitals at risk of closure, limiting services or mass layoffs, with over 300 rural hospitals across the U.S. at disproportionate risk of closure, conversion, or service reductions, and Virginia Healthcare Company blamed the law for the closure of 3 rural clinics serving communities along the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the closures were part of the company's ongoing response to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and the resulting realities for healthcare delivery, which means Trump's signature legislative achievement is literally closing hospitals in the communities that supported him most fervently. Listen to the scale of devastation we're talking about here, because according to the Center for Healthcare Quality and Payment Reform, more than 300 rural hospitals are at immediate risk of closure because they have suffered multi-year financial losses or have very low financial reserves, and these aren't abstract statistics. These are community anchors. These are often the largest employers in small towns. These are the difference between a viable rural community and a ghost town. Of the more than $900 billion in Medicaid cuts in the megabill, about $137 billion of those cuts will impact rural areas, and we've seen press reports tying the recent federal policy changes to plans to close entire hospitals or rural labor and delivery units, which means pregnant women in rural areas will have to drive hours to deliver their babies. Elderly patients will lose access to emergency care, and entire communities will be pushed past the point of viability. And here's the historical parallel that should terrify everyone, because what we're witnessing is the wholesale abandonment of the American heartland in service of tax cuts for billionaires, and this echoes the neoliberal structural adjustment programs that devastated developing nations in the 1990s, where international financial institutions demanded austerity in exchange for loans, and the result was collapsing infrastructure, skyrocketing poverty, and social disintegration. Except now it's happening right here in America's rural communities, and Trump is the one wielding the knife, and for the first time, CNN's polling shows that a clear majority, 56% of people disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the economy, and 56% of people disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the economy, and 56% of people disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the economy, and 56% of people disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the economy, and 56% of people disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the economy, and 56% of people disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the economy, and 56% of people disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the economy, and 56% of people disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the economy, and 56% of people disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the economy, and 56% of people disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the economy, and 56% of people disapprove of Donald Trump's handling. Because people are not stupid. They can see what's happening to their communities, their hospital, their children's school lunch programs. Now let's talk about SNAP, because this is where the cruelty becomes almost cartoonishly villainous. SNAP provides almost $200 in monthly benefits per person to some 40 million recipients nationwide, and the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates some 3 million fewer people will participate in the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, known as SNAP, which means millions of Americans, including children and elderly people, will lose access to basic nutrition. About a third of the budget cuts to Medicaid and SNAP come from imposing work requirements on a greater portion of recipients, including some parents of school-age children for the first time in the history of those programs, which reveals the ideological obsession with punishing poverty that animates Republican policy, because these are not reforms designed to lift people up, they are designed to kick them when they're down. And the philosophical underpinning here is this deeply embedded conservative mythology that poverty is a moral failing rather than a structural condition, and that people need to be disciplined through deprivation rather than supported through solidarity, and you can hear it in the rhetoric when House Speaker Mike Johnson said those safety nets are meant for a small population of people, the elderly, disabled, young, pregnant women who are single, and all these young, able-bodied young men who don't have dependents riding the wagon, which deploys this welfare queen rhetoric that has been used to justify slashing social programs for decades. But the reality is that SNAP has some of the lowest fraud rates of any government program, and the vast majority of recipients are working families, children, elderly people, and people with disabilities who cannot work. But here's where Schumer's critique becomes absolutely devastating, because he's not just cataloging Trump's failures, he's exposing the fundamental con at the heart of Trump's entire political project, which is that Trump ran as a populist champion of the forgotten American, promising to bring costs down on day one, to restore American manufacturing, to fight for working families against coastal elites, and instead Trump said during his campaign that prices would come down on day one, and it is day 23, and prices are up 3%. Despite Trump's promise to lower prices, the overall cost of groceries is higher now than when he was sworn in, which means every single promise he made to working families has been revealed as a lie, and instead he has governed as a plutocrat, implementing the most regressive tax policies in generations, while gutting programs that serve the poor. And what makes this particularly galling is the sheer hypocrisy of Trump positioning himself as the voice of working-class frustration while implementing policies that make their lives demonstrably worse, because around 2/3 of registered voters say the Trump administration has fallen short on the economy and the cost of living, according to a recent poll from NBC News. And when his own Treasury Secretary is asked about this, Bessent said the American people don't know how good they have it, which is perhaps the most tone-deaf Marie Antoinette level of elite detachment imaginable, because families are literally skipping meals, cutting back on medications, choosing between rent and food, and the response from Trump's administration is to tell them they're too stupid to understand how good they have. Now I want you to understand the fiscal mechanics of what's happening here, because this is crucial to grasping the full scope of the con, because President Donald Trump's big bill in Congress would unleash trillions in tax cuts and slash spending, but also spike deficits by $2.4 trillion over the decade, and leave some 10.9 million more people without health insurance. And the president has pledged not to cut Medicaid, even though the current version of the measure would do just that, according to the Congressional Budget Office, and add more than $2 trillion to the deficit over the next decade, which means Trump is simultaneously claiming he's protecting these programs while signing legislation that devastates them, which is gaslighting as policy, which is Orwellian doublespeak in its purest form. And the class dynamics here are absolutely crucial to understand, because the bottom fifth of households by income would gain just 0.6% in income on average from the TCJA tax cuts and lose 7.4% from the Medicaid cuts, bringing their net loss to 6.8%, whereas the top 1% of households would see a net gain of 3.9% from these cuts, which is naked upward redistribution of wealth. This is Robin Hood in reverse. This is taking from the poor to give to the rich, and wrapping it in the rhetoric of fiscal responsibility and deficit reduction, when in fact it's exploding the deficit in order to fund tax cuts for billionaires, while telling working families to tighten their belts. And Schumer is absolutely right to frame this as Trump living in a bubble, because that's precisely what's happening here. We're seeing the cognitive disconnect that occurs when billionaires and their political enablers become so insulated from the material conditions of ordinary people that they genuinely cannot comprehend or refuse to acknowledge that the affordability crisis is real and devastating. And when it comes to the economy, Schumer said this week that Republicans are in this bubble. They don't get it, which is both literally true in that Trump and his cabinet of billionaires have no lived experience of economic insecurity, and metaphorically true in that conservative economic ideology has become so detached from empirical reality that it functions as a kind of collective delusion. But here's where we need to connect this to broader historical and theoretical frameworks, because what we're witnessing is late-stage capitalism in crisis, where the contradictions between the rhetoric of free markets and opportunity and the reality of oligarchic wealth concentration and economic precarity have become so stark that they can no longer be papered over with ideological platitudes, and Trump's response is not to address the underlying structural problems, but to deny their existence, to blame immigrants in China and Democrats, to gaslight the entire population about their own lived experience. And this is textbook authoritarianism. This is how democracies die, not with jackboots and concentration camps necessarily, but with the slow erosion of shared reality, with the destruction of trust in institutions, with the elevation of propaganda over truth. And what Schumer is doing here is essential democratic work. He's creating a counter-narrative. He's providing language and evidence for what people already know in their guts, which is that they're being screwed. He's connecting individual experiences of economic hardship to systemic policy choices, and he's naming the people responsible. And this is why the right-wing media ecosystem works so hard to discredit politicians like Schumer, to paint them as out-of-touch coastal elites, because they need to prevent this kind of class consciousness from taking hold. They need to keep working people divided along lines of race and geography and culture, so they don't unite around their shared economic interests. Now let me bring this full circle to the clip we just watched, because when Schumer says Americans who are paying more for daily essentials want to see the president act, not ramble from a podium, he's articulating the fundamental disconnect between performance and governance, between symbolic politics and material outcomes. Because Trump is a master of the former, he knows how to work a crowd, how to generate headlines, how to dominate the media landscape, but he has no interest in or capacity for the actual work of earning in a way that improves people's lives, and he's distracting and diverting the American people, or trying to with issues that have nothing to do with bringing prices down, like changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico, which is a perfect encapsulation of how authoritarian populism functions as distraction and spectacle, rather than substantive governance. And when Schumer catalogs the specific harms Trump's tariffs have raised prices across the board on groceries, on clothing, on energy, and whose tariffs are they? Donald Trump's. He's doing crucial accountability work, because in our fragmented media environment, where propaganda and disinformation are ubiquitous, it's essential that someone in a position of authority repeatedly, clearly, forcefully connect cause and effect, connect policy and outcome, connect Trump's decisions to families suffering. President Trump is about to embark on an affordability tour around the United States, yet his administration is sabotaging the American people by bowing to big corporations and raising, not lowering, the cost of living, which is the kind of direct confrontation that cuts through the noise. And then Schumer goes further when he talks about Trump promising to bring costs down on day one, and then turning around and cutting healthcare, cutting SNAP benefits, closing rural hospitals, and axing good-paying energy jobs in red and blue states, because this is where Trump's betrayal of his base becomes most apparent, because he promised to fight for forgotten Americans in deindustrialized communities, and instead he's implemented policies that make their lives worse, that close their hospitals, that take away their food assistance, that make their children go hungry. And this should be a source of volcanic political anger. This should mobilize people to demand better, to organize, to resist. But here's the challenge we face, and this is where the analysis has to become more sophisticated, because Trump and the right-wing propaganda apparatus have been remarkably successful at displacing working-class anger away from the billionaire class that's actually immiserating them, and onto scapegoats, immigrants, minorities, journalists, academics, the so-called coastal elites. And this is the fundamental work of fascism, to take legitimate grievances about economic precarity and channel them into reactionary hatred rather than progressive solidarity, and the only counter to that is precisely what Schumer is doing here, which is to relentlessly focus attention on the material facts, on who is making policy decisions and who is benefiting from them, on the actual distribution of resources, power. And we need to be clear about what's at stake here, because the affordability crisis has become a political liability for the White House, as the Trump administration confronts the same reality the Biden administration did. Economic success doesn't really matter to voters if grocery prices are rising, which means this isn't just about economics, it's about political legitimacy, it's about whether democratic governance can deliver for working families, and if Trump succeeds in convincing people that the affordability crisis is fake, that their suffering isn't real, that they should blame immigrants or Democrats rather than his own policies, then we're in profound danger, because that's how you get permanent minority rule, that's how you get fascism. So what do we do with this information? How do we translate Schumer's critique into political action and movement building? And I would argue that we need a multi-pronged strategy. First, we need to continue this work of truth-telling, of documenting and amplifying how Trump's policies are actually affecting real families in concrete terms. Second, we need to organize at every level, from mutual aid networks that provide immediate material support to political campaigns that can win power and implement different policies. Third, we need to build class consciousness. We need to help people understand that their struggle is shared, that it's not their individual failing, but a systemic condition that can only be addressed through collective action. And fourth, we need to offer a genuine alternative, vision, not just opposition to Trump, but a positive program for economic justice that includes Medicare for all, a Green New Deal that creates millions of good-paying jobs, wealth taxes on billionaires, universal basic income or guaranteed jobs programs, massive investments in public housing, infrastructure, childcare, and elder care as public goods, because people need to be able to imagine that a different world is possible, that they don't have to choose between letting billionaires loot the country and accepting grinding poverty as inevitable. And this is where progressive politics has to do better at articulating not just what we're against, but what we're for. And Schumer's speech here is a start. It's necessary but not sufficient, because we need more than parliamentary criticism. We need mass mobilization. We need strikes and boycotts and demonstrations. We need community organizations and tenant unions and worker cooperatives. We need to build power from below while simultaneously fighting for better policies from above. And we need to understand that this is a long struggle, that Trump and Trumpism aren't going away, even if he loses the next election, because the underlying conditions that produced him, the wealth inequality, the corporate capture of democracy, the collapse of social solidarity, the crisis of meaning, those are all still there and getting worse. But there is hope, and the hope lies in what Schumer is pointing to, which is that people know they're being screwed. If now 56% of the people disapprove, he's not in very good electoral shape now, or in the future, which means the con is failing, people are seeing through it, and that creates an opening for genuine progressive alternatives. Schumer and Democrats think the same economic malaise that played a part in sinking their own party in 2024 will help them reclaim power next year, and they're right about that, but only if they offer something real, only if they fight for working families with the same ferocity that Republicans fight for billionaires. So when you watch this clip, when you hear Schumer cataloging Trump's betrayals, understand that this is more than political theater. This is the essential work of democratic accountability. This is how we build the counter-narrative that can mobilize people to action. This is how we expose the con and offer an alternative, and every single one of us has a role to play in amplifying this message, in connecting it to our own communities and organizing for change, because the affordability crisis is real, the suffering is real, and the people responsible need to be held accountable, and that work starts now, today, with each of us choosing to see clearly, to speak truth, to fight back against the gaslighting and the cruelty, to build the world we know is possible.